Hey guys, tonight we start by stepping out of the familiar and into a world that is both ours and not ours. The year is about 400,000 BCE, and you're in a place where the air smells sharp with pine resin, smoke from damp wood fires curls against a grey sky, and the crunch under your feet is not gravel but frost-packed earth, mixed with shards of flint discarded from tool-making. A handful of people sit huddled near a small blaze, their silhouettes sharp against the flicker of flame. Their voices are low, guttural, not quite words as you know them, yet carrying the weight of communication that holds a group together in the cold. The ground is littered with bones, deer, horse, bison, reminders that survival is not a guarantee but a daily gamble. And you, standing there with nothing but curiosity and thin modern skin, probably won't survive the night. These people might manage. They are not quite you, not quite other, but something in between, your lost cousins. If you're here for what happened to our lost cousins, the disappearance of Neanderthals and Denisovans, you're in for a ride across hundreds of thousands of years, across continents, across the fragile divide between survival and extinction. We're going to explore where these cousins came from, how they lived, what they left behind, and why only one branch of the family, your branch, is still walking around making podcasts and TikToks. Stick around, drop a comment with your location and what time it is as you're listening. Imagine Neanderthals trying to figure out why strangers are announcing bedtime in Karachi or Chicago. And if you're curious about the traces of these cousins still hidden in your DNA, well, don't worry, we'll get there too. For now, let's slip into their world, step by step, and see what it really meant to share this stint with family we lost. Sweet dreams. If you can sleep, knowing a giant Ice Age hyena is sniffing nearby. So let's begin with the origin. The story of Neanderthals and Denisovans doesn't begin in Europe or Siberia, though that's where we eventually meet them. It begins much earlier, in Africa, the deep cradle of humanity. Around 600,000 to 800,000 years ago, populations of Homo heidelbergensis, or something very much like them, were spread across Africa and Eurasia. These were tall, broad-chested people with brains not so different in size from your own, already making fire, crafting wooden spears, and organizing cooperative hunts. They were the common ancestors of Neanderthals, Denisovans and Homo sapiens. Think of them as the parent generation, with kids that would eventually go their own ways, and in some cases never come home for holidays. Around 400,000 years ago, something interesting happened. Populations of these archaic humans began to split. Geography was destiny. Some groups stayed in Africa, others wandered into Europe and Asia. Over time, isolation, climate and adaptation sculpted them into different beings. In Europe and the western parts of Asia, the lineage that would become Neanderthals took shape. In Eastern Asia, another group split off and evolved into Denisovans. And back in Africa, the branch that would one day become modern humans quietly prepared for its debut. You can picture this like an ancient family tree growing wild across continents. It wasn't a neat diagram with tidy branches. It was messy. Branches tangled, some snapped off, others twisted together again in moments of contact and interbreeding. But broadly speaking, 3 children of Homo heidelbergensis were on the stage: Neanderthals in the west, Denisovans in the east, and Homo sapiens waiting in the south. Now, Neanderthals. The name comes from the Neander Valley in Germany, where the first bones were unearthed in 1856. But of course they weren't called that at the time. They didn't walk around introducing themselves as, "Hi, I'm a Neanderthal, pleased to grunt." They were simply people of their world. Their features were sculpted by cold climates, broad noses to warm icy air before it hit the lungs, heavy brows like natural helmets, stocky builds with barrel chests, and strong arms perfect for thrusting spears into mammoths. These weren't cave caricatures dragging clubs. They were highly adapted Ice Age specialists. Meanwhile, their eastern cousins, the Denisovans, are frustratingly mysterious. We know them mostly from fragments. A pinky bone here, a tooth there found in Denisova cave in Siberia. But thanks to genetic sequencing, those tiny scraps tell big stories. Denisovans weren't just cave squatters in one chilly corner of the world. Their DNA shows up in populations across Asia and Oceania, meaning they were spread far and wide. You, if you have ancestors from Tibet, Papua New Guinea, or parts of Southeast Asia, may carry Denisovan genes that help your blood carry oxygen at high altitudes. A souvenir from a cousin you never met. Let's go back to that 400,000-year mark. Imagine the world then. Europe was locked in cycles of glaciation, sheets of ice creeping forward, then retreating. Forests shrank, grasslands opened, rivers froze. Life here was brutal, but Neanderthals endured. In the east, Denisovans were dealing with vast mountains, steppe lands, and the occasional saber-toothed cat. In Africa, Homo sapiens ancestors were watching all this from warmer climates, slowly refining their survival toolkit. Here's the first joke of the night. If you think family reunions now are awkward, imagine inviting Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens to the same barbecue. Someone would show up with mammoth steaks, someone else with shellfish, and by the end, half the guests would be staring suspiciously at the other half's brow ridges. But let's be clear, these weren't strangers in the sense of separate species like lions and tigers. They were close enough that when they met, they recognized each other as possible mates, sometimes willingly, sometimes maybe less so. Genetic evidence tells us that Neanderthals, Denisovans, and early Homo sapiens interbred multiple times across tens of thousands of years. So while we talk about them as separate, the boundaries were porous. It's important to remember too that none of this was inevitable. Evolution doesn't have a script, no guiding hand steering things toward Netflix subscriptions and oat milk lattes. It's improvisation, adaptation. Neanderthals and Denisovans could easily have been the survivors, and Homo sapiens the ones remembered only in fossil fragments. You wouldn't be listening to this right now, or maybe a Neanderthal version of you would, chuckling at how weirdly fragile Homo sapiens were. Now, to set the stage for everything that comes after, let's lay down the timeline. Homo heidelbergensis emerges roughly 700,000 years ago. By 400,000 years ago, its populations are already splitting into regional descendants. Neanderthals dominate Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans spread east, and early Homo sapiens stay in Africa. Neanderthals persist until about 40,000 years ago. Denisovans survive at least until 30,000 years ago, maybe later in remote refuges. Homo sapiens, well, you know how that story ends, because you're here. And what's fascinating is that for most of this long timeline, nobody is winning yet. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals thrived in their world. Denisovans held their ground. Homo sapiens were just another player, not yet the dominant one. You think your modern hustle is tough? Try keeping your clan fed in a landscape where winter can last decades, and your competition has just as much muscle and brain power as you do. So tonight, as you lie in bed listening, imagine the flicker of that ancient firelight on faces both strange and familiar, the smell of fat sizzling on hot stone, the press of cold air against your skin, and the awareness that this was the beginning of a story not just about survival, but about disappearance. Because for two of these cousins, the line would end. The mystery, the tension, lies not in their existence, but in their absence. They were strong, smart, resilient. They lived across vast lands, endured brutal climates, made tools, art, and families. And yet, they are gone. That is the haunting truth we carry forward. Their shadows live in us, but their voices are silent. Tonight we follow those voices as far back as we can. From the first sparks of fire in the hands of Homo heidelbergensis to the last embers fading in the caves of southern Spain and the mountains of Siberia. Their story is our story too, but with a different ending. Neanderthals did not appear suddenly like a magic trick. They were the product of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, shaped by climate, geography, and sheer endurance. By around 300,000 years ago, they were firmly established in Europe and the western stretches of Asia. When you picture them, don't imagine some shaggy, grunting caricature. Think of people as human as you are, with brains just as big, sometimes even bigger, and with lives that demanded constant awareness, adaptability, and grit. You trudge with them now through the landscapes they called home, icy plains under pale winter suns, thick forests where elk and aurochs moved in cautious herds, and rocky shelters overlooking rivers swollen with glacial melt. Every step you take crunches over frost, every breath hangs white in the air, and your chest aches because you weren't designed for this climate. But they were. Neanderthals spread widely across Europe, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the Ural Mountains, and down into the Near East. Fossil remains tell us they lived in what is now France, Germany, Italy, Croatia, and beyond. They weren't simply wandering nomads without purpose. They moved with the rhythms of animals, seasons, and glacial shifts. Their distribution maps neatly onto the Great Ice Age corridors, places where game clustered and where caves or rock overhangs could shelter families from wind and snow. When the glaciers retreated during warmer interludes, they followed rivers and valleys into new territories, leaving traces of themselves in layers of stone tools and hearths. You step into one of their shelters now, a limestone cave in southern France, its walls damp with mineral drips, its floor scattered with flint flakes from tool-making. The smell of smoke lingers, not unpleasant but thick, like wool that's been singed. Near the mouth of the cave, animal hides stretch taut on wooden frames, drying in the thin sun. Inside, a group huddles, children playing with discarded bones, adults shaping spear points, one person carefully scraping meat from a hide with a sharp flake. These were not primitive brutes. They were skilled workers, hunters and parents with routines and responsibilities. Their tools, the Mosterian tradition, were a hallmark of Neanderthal ingenuity. Instead of simply striking rocks together to make crude flakes, they used a prepared core technique, shaping the stone first and then striking off flakes with control. The result: standardized, sharp, versatile tools, scrapers for hides, points for hunting, blades for cutting. It was the Ice Age equivalent of a Swiss Army knife. Imagine trying to butcher a mammoth without one of those. You'd be gnawing for days. Food, of course, was the center of life. Neanderthals were hunters of big game: mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, bison, wild horses, red deer. They hunted with thrusting spears, meaning you had to get up close, closer than most of us would ever dare. Imagine standing only a few meters away from a charging bison, your heart hammering, your spear braced against its chest. If you miss, you're trampled. If you succeed, your clan eats for weeks. Survival was a team sport, and Neanderthals played it with courage and coordination. And it wasn't only meat. Newer evidence from plant remains stuck in Neanderthal teeth shows they ate a varied diet: nuts, seeds, tubers, berries. They knew their environment, which plants to cook, which to avoid, which might soothe pain. Picture them boiling bitter plants in wooden containers lined with animal hides, using heated stones to transfer warmth into the liquid. It wasn't gourmet cooking, but it was survival cuisine. Their bodies mirrored their world, stocky and muscular, with shorter limbs compared to Homo sapiens. Neanderthals were built for conserving heat. Their rib cages were wide, giving them barrel chests. Their bones were thick and strong, marked with the scars of muscles that would make your gym sessions look laughable. They could withstand cold that would freeze you in minutes, and they could haul carcasses that would break your back. In short, they were not less evolved, they were differently evolved, tailored to their climate. Family life played out in those caves and open-air camps. Firelight cast shadows on stone walls, stories unspoken but shared in gestures and glances. We can't know the sound of their voices, but their hyoid bones, part of the vocal apparatus, suggest they could speak in ways far more complex than animal grunts. Did they tell stories of hunts? Did they lull children with soothing tones as you're listening now? Did they argue over whose turn it was to scrape hides? Likely yes to all of it. Here's one of your 3 jokes for this section. Imagine the world's first toddler tantrum, a Neanderthal child refusing mammoth marrow stew, while the adults rolled their deep-set eyes and muttered, "Kids haven't changed in 300,000 years." Neanderthals weren't confined to caves, either. Evidence shows they built shelters out of wood and hide, using branches lashed together, mammoth bones as frames, hides stretched tight for warmth. Some campsites were organized with areas for sleeping, tool-making, and cooking, the beginnings of domestic space. You see the sparks of cultural identity here, the concept of home, however simple, where life is structured around tasks, family, and safety. Let's not forget their adaptability. Neanderthals survived in climates that swung violently between warm interglacials and bitterly cold glaciations. They adjusted diets, hunting strategies, and movement patterns accordingly. They weren't stuck in one way of life. When forests spread, they hunted deer in dense woods. When tundra stretched wide, they targeted herds on open plains. That flexibility is what allowed them to persist for hundreds of thousands of years. And yes, they had to deal with predators, lions, leopards, hyenas, cave bears. Imagine creeping into a cave only to discover a massive bear already curled up inside, snoring. Do you back away slowly, or do you poke it with a spear and hope for the best? If you guessed the second, congratulations, you're a Neanderthal. Fossil evidence of bite marks on Neanderthal bones suggests that sometimes the gamble didn't pay off. But here's the key. Neanderthals weren't marginal survivors scraping by. They thrived. For longer than Homo sapiens have existed so far, Neanderthals ruled Europe. When you measure time in tens of thousands of years, that's impressive. By comparison, modern industrial civilization is barely a sneeze in history's timeline. If Neanderthals had kept going, they might still be here, rolling their eyes at our obsession with avocado toast. You walk now through a glacial valley. In Central Europe, the wind cuts like a blade, your ears burn with cold. Ahead, Neanderthal hunters move in silence, spears at the ready. Their breath steams in the air, their eyes scan the white horizon. This was their world, not one of luxury, but of mastery. They knew its dangers, its resources, its patterns. They had lived here long before Homo sapiens wandered out of Africa, and for millennia they were unchallenged. Still, even as they spread, their range had limits. The deepest cold zones of northern Eurasia seemed to have been avoided. Perhaps even Neanderthals couldn't endure the harshest permafrost. Their distribution curved instead through regions where game was plentiful and shelter possible. Southern Europe, the Balkans, the Levant. These were the heartlands of Neanderthal life. And with their spread came diversity. Neanderthals weren't all identical. Regional variations developed, differences in tool styles, in skeletal features, in adaptation to local resources. Some groups may have been more robust, others more slender. Some favored caves, others open-air settlements. Over hundreds of thousands of years, they experimented with ways of living that worked for their particular slice of the Ice Age. Second joke of the section. Picture a Neanderthal family debating where to set up camp. One wants the cave with a nice view, another prefers the one closer to the bison herd. and someone else just mutters, "As long as it has good Wi-Fi." For archaeologists, every flake of stone, every soot-stained hearth is a whisper of these lives. In France, Spain, Germany, Italy, we find layers of occupation stretching back ages, each one a sign that Neanderthals weren't drifting shadows. They came back, season after season, generation after generation. They remembered landscapes. They passed knowledge along. They made traditions. It's tempting to romanticize them as noble survivors, but let's keep the reality sharp. Life was still brutal. Child mortality was high. Injuries from hunting and fights with predators left scars. Many skeletons show signs of healed fractures, meaning they cared for each other, tended to the wounded. This is one of the most human things about them. In a world where survival was a razor's edge, compassion mattered. You carried the injured, you shared food, you kept the group together, and this perhaps is the best image to end on for now. A Neanderthal group gathered at twilight, snow falling softly outside the cave. Firelight glows against the stone. Children huddle close to warmth. An elder sharpens a spear. Another chews dried meat. Outside, the vast Ice Age world stretches endless and dangerous. But inside, for this night, there is safety, there is family, there is continuity. They may be your lost cousins, but in this moment, you recognize them. Third joke before we close this section. Neanderthal bedtime stories probably went something like, "Once upon a time there was a mammoth, and then we ate it." The end. If Neanderthals are the cousins you know well, the ones whose family albums you've paged through with dozens of fossil sites, stone tools, and fire-blackened hearths, then Denisovans are the mysterious relatives whose names you've only just heard whispered at reunions. You don't even have a photograph of them, just a couple of scraps. A finger bone, a few teeth, fragments of jaw, and a scattering of genetic code. And yet, from that tiny collection, we've built an image of an entire people who once ranged across Asia. Their story begins in a cave tucked deep in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a place you step into now, where cold air seeps down from the peaks and the smell of dust, stone and bat guano wraps around you. This is Denisova Cave, and if you're listening closely, you can almost hear echoes of voices that haven't spoken in tens of thousands of years. In 2008, scientists sifting through layers of this cave's sediments discovered a fragment of a child's pinky bone, small, unremarkable, the kind of thing you'd overlook on a casual walk. But geneticists extracted DNA from it, and what they found blew open the story of human evolution. The bone belonged not to a Neanderthal, not to a modern human, but to a distinct group, Denisovans, named after the cave. They had lived here, in this cold, high-altitude landscape, alongside both Neanderthals and modern humans. One child's bone changed everything. It turns out Denisovans weren't confined to Siberia. Their DNA, extracted from that finger bone and other sparse remains, shows up in living humans today, especially in populations from East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. Papuans and Aboriginal Australians carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Tibetans inherited a particular gene from Denisovans that lets them survive with low oxygen at high altitudes, a genetic gift that explains why you can trek up Everest Base Camp while your sea-level lungs scream in protest. It's as if Denisovans, though vanished, still whisper through your blood, offering little survival tricks. But here's the twist. While their genetic legacy is clear, their fossil record is threadbare. We don't have a complete Denisovan skeleton. We can't yet picture their faces or bodies with certainty. Were they as stocky as Neanderthals? As slender as early Homo sapiens? Did they have broad noses, or narrow, dark skin, or light? We don't know. Their entire identity has been assembled from fragments. That's why, standing in Denisova Cave, you feel more haunted than informed. You're in the presence of people you know existed, but who remain stubbornly invisible. Let's piece together what we can. Denisova Cave itself is a treasure trove. Layers of sediment there hold traces of habitation stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Both Neanderthals and Denisovans lived there, at times overlapping, at times alternating. Imagine it like an ancient Airbnb, where different tenants checked in. Depending on the Ice Age season, fires burned on its floors, stone tools littered the ground, animals were butchered in its dark corners. It was both shelter and workshop, a hub of survival in a rugged mountain landscape. What's astonishing is how far Denisovans seem to have spread. Genetic evidence suggests they weren't just Siberian mountain dwellers. Their DNA is found in people as far as Papua New Guinea, thousands of miles away, which means Denisovans once ranged across vast parts of Asia, adapting to tropical forests, high plateaus, and everything in between. Picture them moving through bamboo forests in Southeast Asia, through the Himalayan foothills, across windswept plains of northern China. They were versatile, enduring, and widespread, yet we've barely scratched the surface of their remains. Here's your first joke of the section. Imagine Denisovans knowing how famous they'd become from a single pinky bone. Really? Out of everything we did, you're going to remember me for my finger? Great. The teeth tell us a bit more. Denisovan molars found in the cave are massive, larger than those of Neanderthals or modern humans. They suggest robust jaws, perhaps powerful chewing muscles, adapted to tough diets, roots, fibrous plants, maybe raw meat. Whatever they ate, their teeth were up for the challenge. Combine that with the high-altitude adaptation seen in modern Tibetans, and you picture hardy people, built to withstand environments that would leave you gasping. Even more intriguing, Denisova Cave gave us evidence of interbreeding not just between Denisovans and modern humans, but between Denisovans and Neanderthals. One bone fragment belonged to a girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and father a Denisovan, a literal hybrid child, preserved in the dirt of a Siberian cave for tens of thousands of years. Family drama, Ice Age edition. What does that mean? It means these groups weren't isolated as neatly as textbooks once suggested. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans met, mingled, and sometimes made families. Their stories braided together in ways we're only beginning to understand, and those braids are still visible in your DNA. Now picture the Denisovans moving across Asia. The world they knew was shifting constantly. Glaciers advanced and retreated, opening and closing corridors of migration. Rivers carved new paths, forests spread and shrank. They adapted. Where mammoths roamed, they hunted. Where forests grew thick, they gathered plants and fruits. Where mountains towered, they adjusted their blood to handle the thin air. That's not luck. That's evolution, fine-tuning survival. And yet, for all their resilience, Denisovans are ghosts. Unlike Neanderthals, whose caves and tools we've studied for over a century, Denisovans left us barely any artifacts we can confidently assign to them. A bracelet found in Denisova Cave, a polished green stone, drilled with remarkable precision, may have been theirs, or may have been made by another group. We don't know. If it was theirs, then Denisovans weren't just survivors, they were artisans. Imagine them polishing stone jewelry under firelight, the gleam of green against rough hands. It hints at culture, creativity, beauty, but it's still just a hint. Second joke of the section. If archaeology were a family mystery show, Neanderthals would have a whole photo album, and Denisovans would be the cousin you can only find on LinkedIn with no profile picture. Despite the gaps, Denisovans mattered. Their DNA didn't just slip quietly into modern humans, it shaped us. That high-altitude gene in Tibetans is a Denisovan gift. Other Denisovan genes influence immune systems, fat metabolism, even how bodies respond to cold. In other words, you're not just Homo sapiens, you're part Denisovan, part Neanderthal, a walking cocktail of ancient experiments. That's the hidden punchline of human history. Our lost cousins aren't entirely lost. So let's zoom in on what this really means. When early Homo sapiens left Africa around 60,000 years ago, they didn't step into an empty world. They entered territories already held by Neanderthals and Denisovans. Every valley, every river crossing, every mountain pass came with footprints already there. Meeting these cousins wasn't rare. It was inevitable. Sometimes it led to competition, sometimes to cooperation, sometimes to children who carried mixed heritages forward. That's why today, if you trace your DNA, you may find little echoes of Denisova cave inside yourself. Now you walk again into that Siberian cave. It's cold, damp, the light dim where it filters in through the mouth. On the ground, a scattering of flint flakes crunches underfoot. You bend down and pick up a tooth the size of your thumb. It's heavy, ridged, worn with use. You're holding a Denisovan molar, a relic of someone who lived, ate, laughed, suffered and vanished long before pyramids or written words. For all their absence, they are suddenly present. Here's the third joke for this section. If Denisovans could see the genetic testing industry today, they'd probably laugh. You paid $100 to learn your 2% me. Should have just asked. And this is what's remarkable. In a way, Denisovans never really disappeared. Yes, their bones are rare, their caves quiet, but their blood flows in millions of people alive today, scattered across the globe. Each time someone in Tibet breathes easy at high altitude, each time an immune system fights off a pathogen with Denisovan efficiency, you're seeing their survival still in action. So while Neanderthals give us caves, tools and paintings, Denisovans give us mystery, invisibility, and yet a legacy woven deeply into our biology. They remind you that history isn't just what you can touch or see. Sometimes it's hidden in the code of your cells, waiting for science to uncover it. And as you leave Denisova cave behind, stepping back into the chill night, you realize the story of your lost cousins isn't about bones alone. It's about connection, inheritance, and the strange, quiet ways the past insists on living in you. You push forward into the Ice Age world, and now the focus sharpens not on who Neanderthals and Denisovans were, but how they managed to survive day by day. Picture the sheer grind of life in a world where glaciers loomed on the horizon, where winters could stretch unforgivingly long, and where survival meant mastering the elements rather than escaping them. The air you breathe burns cold in your nostrils, your fingers ache within minutes of exposure, and every sound, the snap of branches, the distant call of a raven, carries with a clarity sharpened by the frozen stillness. This was their environment, and unlike you, fumbling for a heated blanket, they had the skills to endure it. The first defense against the cold was clothing. Animal hides became the fashion of necessity. Imagine a Neanderthal woman scraping a deer hide with a flint scraper, rubbing it with fat to soften it, then sewing it with sinew and a bone needle into a rough but effective coat. Evidence from archaeological sites suggests Neanderthals were tailoring hides into fitted garments, rather than just draping skins over their shoulders. They knew that warmth depended on snugness, layering, and keeping out wind. Denisovans, living in climates ranging from Siberian mountains to tropical forests, likely adapted their wardrobes accordingly. Thick furs in the north, lighter wraps in warmer climates. You may not think of them as fashion icons, but their survival couture put early Gucci to shame. Shelter was equally vital. Caves were convenient, yes, but not always available or safe, sometimes already occupied by cave bears or leopards. So they built post holes and stone arrangements at certain sites, hint at wooden structures covered with hides, sometimes incorporating mammoth bones as supports. These Ice Age homes were windbreaks, warmth traps, centers of community. Step inside one, a circle of bones and wood lashed together, hides stretched tight, fire flickering at the center. Smoke curls upward through a hole in the roof, the air inside warmer than the killing cold outside. You can almost feel your frozen toes thawing. Fire was their constant companion, not just a tool for warmth, but a hub of life. Hearths dotted Neanderthal and Denisovan sites, circles of blackened stone filled with charcoal. Fire meant cooked meat, roasted tubers, light in the dark, protection from predators, but making fire in an Ice Age blizzard was no easy feat. They struck flint against iron pyrite to shower sparks onto dry tinder, coaxed fragile flames into roaring hearths, guarded embers through the night. Imagine huddling close, the heat on your face, your back still shivering from the cold. That fire was life itself. And life required calories. Lots of them. Neanderthals especially were big eaters, burning thousands of calories daily to fuel their stocky, muscular bodies in freezing climates. Their hunts weren't casual affairs. They tracked herds of mammoth, bison, and wild horses, coordinating ambushes. Spears in hand, they drove animals into traps, cliffs, or swamps. Archaeological evidence shows bones split for marrow, skulls cracked for brains, fat prized as energy gold. Meat was roasted, marrow sucked, hides turned into clothes. Nothing wasted. This wasn't sport, it was survival, and everyone from children to elders had a role to play. Yet they weren't only carnivores. Plant residues on Neanderthal teeth revealed diets that included nuts, seeds, mushrooms, and grasses. In some sites there's evidence of cooking plants, even medicinal use. One skeleton showed traces of poplar bark, which contains salicylic acid, basically aspirin. Another showed chamomile, a bitter plant with soothing properties. Imagine a Neanderthal with a toothache chewing bark for relief. Primitive? Not at all. It was pharmacology before pharmacies. Hunting, gathering, sheltering, all of it required teamwork. These groups weren't huge, maybe 20 to 30 individuals, but they were tight-knit. Injured hunters show healed fractures, meaning others cared for them during recovery. Children needed constant tending. Elders carried knowledge of landscapes, migrations, and weather. A community could not afford to leave anyone behind because every hand mattered, every role counted. Predators loomed large. Lions, wolves, hyenas, bears. The Ice Age world teemed with tooth and claw. Fossil sites show Neanderthals killed large predators, perhaps for fur, perhaps for self-defense. But sometimes they lost. Bite marks on Neanderthal bones tell grim stories, ambushed while hunting, dragged from shelters, mauled in the night. Survival wasn't just about endurance, it was about constant vigilance. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every shifting shadow, was a potential threat. You think your neighborhood raccoons are scary? Try facing a cave hyena the size of a modern lion. And then there was the cold itself. During glacial peaks, ice sheets covered much of Europe, pushing Neanderthals south into more temperate refuges. As ice retreated, they expanded north again. This endless push-pull shaped their migrations, diets, and strategies. Denisovans, meanwhile, seemed to thrive in even harsher environments. Siberian mountains, Tibetan plateaus. Their genetic legacy proves they adapted biologically to oxygen-thin air, a feat Homo sapiens only later borrowed from them. Imagine living your whole life at 15,000 feet while others gasped for breath. Denisovans carried that off with ease. Here's your first joke for this section. If Neanderthals had Instagram, it would just be endless posts of mammoth steaks and fire selfies. Ice Age eats, no filter. The rhythm of their lives was dictated by seasons. Spring meant tracking herds moving north. Summer brought plant gathering and fishing in rivers swollen with meltwater. Autumn was for storing fat, drying meat, preparing hides. Winter was the hardest, when food grew scarce and the cold pressed hardest. Families huddled in shelters, rationed supplies, clung to survival until the world thawed again. Imagine the relief of the first spring sun on frozen faces. the Ice Age equivalent of your first coffee after a bad night's sleep. Even in this relentless grind, there was space for care, ritual, and perhaps even beauty. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal burial revealed pollen grains, suggesting flowers may have been laid with the body. Whether symbolic or accidental, it hints at emotional depth, firelight, song-like speech, shared food. These weren't just survival tactics, they were human moments. Denisovans, though less visible, surely had the same. Second joke of the section. Picture a Denisovan teenager sighing, "Ugh, not mammoth again," while their parents insisted, "Eat it, it's full of good fat." Some dinner table dramas never change. Now imagine yourself among them, crouching near a fire after a day's hunt. The air inside the hide tent smells of smoke and fat. Children play with bone toys. Someone sharpens a spear for tomorrow. Outside, wind howls across frozen plains, but inside, life persists. It's not comfortable, it's not glamorous, but it's enough. And enough was victory in the Ice Age. Still, you feel the tension. You know with hindsight that these cousins won't survive forever, that despite their resilience, the cold, the predators, the hunts, something larger looms ahead. For now, though, they are strong, adapted, masters of their world. They endure, generation after generation, through climates and challenges that would crush you within days. Third joke of the section, Neanderthals probably looked at Homo sapiens arriving later and thought, "They'll never make it in this climate," the Ice Age equivalent of underestimating someone on their first day at work. And so, as you step back from the fire and let the cold bite at your skin once more, you understand why Neanderthals and Denisovans lasted so long. They weren't weak, they weren't doomed from the start. They had the tools, the skills, and the resilience to make harsh landscapes livable. They carved a life out of ice and stone, and for hundreds of thousands of years, they did it well. What happened next? The pressures of climate, competition, and contact would come later, but for now, here in the depths of prehistory, you can almost feel their warmth beside the fire, hear their voices echoing in the dark, and know that survival, at its most raw, was their art. You crouch beside a scatter of stone flakes, the air sharp with the smell of fresh flaked flint. The sound is rhythmic, a crack, a pop, a ringing like tiny bells as stone meets stone. Here is where Neanderthals, Denisovans, and even your own ancestors spent hours shaping the tools that would define their survival. Technology wasn't an optional luxury. It was the thin line between a full belly and starvation, between warmth and frostbite. Tonight you get to look closely at those tools, the fingerprints of minds that were anything but primitive. Neanderthals are best known for their Mousterian tradition. Around 60,000 years ago, this tool culture flourished, distinguished by a deliberate, almost mathematical method, the Levala technique. Instead of haphazardly striking stones to produce jagged flakes, Neanderthals prepared a core first, carefully shaping a piece of flint or shirt into a domed form. Then, with a precise strike, they could knock off a flake that was sharp, thin, and uniform. It was pre-planned engineering, not random banging. The flakes themselves became knives, scrapers, spear points. Archaeologists sometimes joke that it was the Ice Age version of 3D printing, design first, product second. Imagine the concentration involved. A Neanderthal sits cross-legged, a chunk of flint in hand, eyes narrowed, sparks leap with each strike, flakes fly, a child watches from nearby, absorbing technique without a word. By the end, the hunter has a perfect spear point. Slide it into a wooden shaft, lash it tight with sinew, coat it in resin made from pine pitch. Suddenly you have a deadly thrusting spear, capable of piercing the hide of a bison. No factories, no instruction manuals, just inherited skill passed from hand to hand. Denisovans, though less visible in the archaeological record, likely shared or developed similar traditions. Some researchers suspect that artifacts found in Siberia, delicate bone needles, a polished green bracelet with a drilled hole, may have been theirs. That bracelet, more than 40,000 years old, was crafted with astonishing precision. To make a hole through stone requires knowledge of abrasion, steady pressure, and patience. You hold that bracelet in your mind now, green stone polished smooth, worn perhaps on a wrist as ornament or symbol. Suddenly, Denisovans are not faceless shadows. They are artists, engineers, makers. Of course, tools weren't limited to stone. Wooden spears preserved in German peat bogs, dating back 300,000 years, show that Neanderthal ancestors were crafting weapons of balance and sophistication long before Homo sapiens appeared in Europe. These spears, straight and smooth, with carefully sharpened tips, were weighted to fly through the air. The earliest javelins. Picture a hunting party lining up along a herd's path, spears poised, the air tense before the throw. Those spears weren't clumsy clubs, they were aerodynamic missiles. Here's the first joke of this section. If Neanderthals had a tech convention, it would be a bunch of hunters showing off their new spearhead designs. This one cuts mammoth hide in half the time. Available now, limited edition. Beyond weapons, there were scrapers for hides, awls for piercing holes, blades for butchering, hammerstones for shaping. Bone and antler were pressed into service too, flexible, sharp, resilient. Fire itself was both tool and technology, mastered through endless practice. Together, this toolkit was sophisticated enough to sustain hundreds of thousands of years of survival. And then along came Homo sapiens with their flair for innovation. By 50,000 years ago, early modern humans were making blades that were longer, thinner, more efficient. They invented projectile weapons, atlatls, spear throwers, bows, and arrows. Imagine a Neanderthal watching in disbelief as a Homo sapiens hunter launches a spear from 20 meters away with deadly accuracy, without having to risk charging close. It was like watching someone invent Wi-Fi while you were still sending letters by pigeon. This doesn't mean Neanderthals were inferior. They excelled at what they needed most. Their thrusting spears were devastating at close range, ideal for ambush hunting. Their scrapers and knives were perfectly tuned to their world, but Homo sapiens' tools gave them an edge in flexibility, range, and efficiency. Think about how tools shape daily routines. A Neanderthal woman sharpens a scraper to clean a hide, working it smooth so it becomes a cloak. A child picks up discarded flakes to play, perhaps cutting meat clumsily. A Denisovan carves grooves into bone, testing pressure, experimenting with shape. These acts weren't mindless. They were creative, innovative, and thoughtful. You can almost hear the quiet concentration, the crackle of fire, the small sigh when a tool finally comes out right. Second joke of the section, the Ice Age version of First World Problems was probably someone dropping their freshly made spearhead and watching it shatter on the cave floor. Cue the oldest recorded facepalm. What's striking is the persistence of tradition. Masterian tools were used for tens of thousands of years, with little variation. Some see this as a lack of creativity, others see it as practicality. If a method works, why reinvent it? In a world where survival consumed every ounce of energy, stability was success. Homo sapiens, by contrast, seemed restless, always tweaking, experimenting, diversifying. That contrast may have played a role in why one lineage outlasted the others. Yet, Neanderthals and Denisovans weren't static. In sites where they overlapped with Homo sapiens, you sometimes see tool styles blending, Lavala flakes mixed with blade technology, bone tools appearing alongside stone. This suggests exchange, imitation, or even collaboration. Imagine a meeting by a riverbank, one group showing another a new way to shape a point, a moment of curiosity crossing the gulf of difference. Even fire-making evolved. Evidence suggests Neanderthals mastered techniques for carrying embers, preserving heat across days. Some may have used manganese dioxide, a mineral, to reduce the ignition temperature of wood, essentially inventing a primitive fire accelerant. That's not brutish ignorance, that's chemical innovation. Denisovans, too, may have left fingerprints of innovation in genetic legacies. Some genes hint at adaptations that suggest they processed plants differently, metabolized fats more efficiently, and maybe even used tools suited to unique diets. Though the artifacts are rare, their impact lives on invisibly in your metabolism, your blood, your immune system. Tools can be genetic as well as stone. Third joke for this section: imagine trying to teach a modern teenager to knap flint. After 5 minutes they'd say, "Can't I just 3D print this?" And a Neanderthal would roll their heavy brow ridges and mutter, "Kids these days." As you stand now amid the scatter of flint and bone, you see tools not as objects, but as extensions of mind and body. Every sharp edge, every drilled hole, every polished surface is a record of thought, intention and memory. Neanderthals and Denisovans were not almost human. They were human in their mastery of survival through technology. Their world was carved, flaked, and sharpened into being. And when you look at your phone, your headphones, the lights above you, you realize the same truth holds. Technology is the thread of survival. From flint flakes to fiber optics, the difference is speed, not essence. Your cousins built their world one flake at a time. You build yours one pixel at a time. But the impulse to create, to solve, to endure has always been the same. Step deeper into the dimness of a cave, the flicker of firelight brushing across rock walls. The smell of smoke clings to your hair, and somewhere water drips steadily in the dark. At first glance you see only soot stains and scratches, but then your eyes adjust, and there in red ochre and black charcoal, lines emerge. Shapes, hand stencils, even the faint image of an animal. These are not the doodles of idle hands. They are the marks of Neanderthals. The revelation comes slowly. Your lost cousins were not just survivors. They were symbol makers. They dreamed, they decorated, they left behind more than tools and bones. For a long time, archaeologists assumed symbolic thought was exclusive to Homo sapiens. Art, jewelry, ritual. These were the crown jewels of modern humans. But discoveries in caves like La Pasega in Spain, dated to more than 65,000 years ago, changed that story. Neanderthals had painted red ladder-like symbols, handprints, and geometric shapes long before modern humans reached the area. They weren't copying anyone. They were the artists. You press your palm against the same rock and realize this was their way of saying, "We are here." And it wasn't just paint. Neanderthals crafted pendants from eagle talons and shells, sometimes stained with pigment. At sites in France and Croatia, eagle claws bear cut marks, smoothed edges, signs of wear as ornaments. Imagine a Neanderthal woman tying a claw to a cord and slipping it over her child's neck. Symbolism, adornment, perhaps status, all alive tens of thousands of years ago. These weren't brute survival machines. They cared for meaning as much as meat. Burials add another layer. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, Neanderthal skeletons were found positioned deliberately, some sprinkled with flower pollen. Was this coincidence? Flowers carried in by rodents? Or was it intentional? A farewell gesture from grieving kin? The debate rages, but the possibility lingers. To bury someone, to place them in earth with care, suggests more than biology. It suggests ritual, memory, perhaps even belief. Denisovans are harder to read here. Their archaeological record is scant, but if they interbred, exchanged genes, and shared tools with Neanderthals and modern humans, it's likely they too engaged in symbolic acts. The bracelet from Denisova Cave hints at aesthetic sensibilities: polished green stone, drilled with a precision hole, too delicate to be mere utility. It might have gleamed in firelight, carrying significance beyond survival. Here's your first joke for the section. Imagine a Neanderthal teen showing off their new eagle claw necklace, while a sibling rolls their eyes and mutters, "So last season." Fashion drama is apparently eternal. The act of art and adornment points to deeper questions: language, storytelling, imagination. Could Neanderthals and Denisovans speak as you do? The evidence suggests yes. Their hyoid bones, crucial for speech, were shaped like ours. Their ear canals were tuned to hear frequencies of human voices. Genetic studies reveal they carried FOX2, a gene linked to language. So yes, they likely spoke. Maybe not Shakespearean soliloquies, but words, names, warnings, jokes, lullabies. Picture a Neanderthal father leaning over a fire, telling his child a story about a great hunt, hands carving shapes into the air. The child laughs, mimics, repeats. A Denisovan elder sings softly in a cave high in the Altai, her voice echoing against stone, binding the group in shared memory. Words, gestures, symbols, these things created community, and community created continuity. Caves themselves became canvases. Deep inside, beyond the reach of daylight, they painted and carved. Why venture so far into darkness unless the act mattered? Some scholars suggest rituals, initiation ceremonies, even shamanic practices. Imagine torches casting eerie shadows, voices chanting, the smell of burning fat and stone lamps. The cave walls came alive, the art part of an experience larger than survival. And then there is the simple but profound act of hand stencils. Glow pigment over your hand, pressed against stone, and you leave a negative, a ghost of your presence. Thousands of years later, you place your hand over it, palm to palm, separated by time. You feel the universality and need to be seen, to leave a mark. Neanderthals reached across time without knowing it. Second joke of the section. If Neanderthals had TikTok, it would just be endless clips of hand stencils set to drum beats. Viral content 65,000 years in the making. Art and burial also hint at abstract thought, the capacity to imagine things not directly in front of you. A symbol stands for something unseen. A burial acknowledges a world beyond the living moment. This is the root of spirituality, of myth, of memory. It's the bridge between raw survival and culture. Neanderthals even experimented with pigments. Blocks of ochre, manganese dioxide, and other minerals were collected, ground, applied. Some may have been used for body paint, decoration, even fire acceleration. The colors were intentional, chosen, applied. Think about the leap that represents not just making tools to survive, but making marks to express. Its humanity expanded. Denisovans remain elusive here, but their shared ancestry and exchanges with Neanderthals and Homo sapiens make it hard to imagine they lacked symbolic expression. Perhaps their art lies undiscovered, buried in caves across Asia, waiting to rewrite history again. Third joke for the section. Archaeologists argue fiercely over whether Neanderthals had art. Meanwhile, the Neanderthal artist from 65,000 years ago is probably sighing in the afterlife, "Yes, I painted the ladder. Get over it." As you sit back against the cold stone, torchlight flickering, you realize something profound. Survival alone cannot explain these acts. Art, adornment, burial, these are about identity, memory, connection. Neanderthals and Denisovans weren't evolutionary dead ends. They were storytellers in their own right. Their stories were painted on walls, tied around necks, whispered over graves. And now in this cave, you listen to echoes of those whispers. The handprints on the wall look back at you. The pendant gleams faintly in the firelight. The pollen grains linger in the soil. You understand your lost cousins weren't only hunters and survivors, they were dreamers. The fire crackles low, and you shift closer to its warmth, but your mind is already wandering forward in time, toward the moment when your ancestors and your cousins would meet face to face. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals had Europe, Denisovans had swathes of Asia, and Homo sapiens, your branch, remained tucked in Africa, refining tools and culture. But around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens began moving out, spreading across the world like wind-blown seeds. Inevitably, paths crossed. The first meetings between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, between Homo sapiens and Denisovans, were not cinematic clashes of rival tribes. They were quieter, messier, sometimes violent, sometimes intimate, and always world-changing. Imagine walking with one of those first groups of sapiens as they move north out of the Levant. You're leaner, taller, with a chin that juts more than your cousin's heavy-browed face. The grasslands stretch before you, dotted with herds of gazelle and aurochs. And then you see them, a small band of Neanderthals, broad-shouldered, stocky, wrapped in furs. Both groups freeze, eyes meeting across the fire gap of evolutionary time. Recognition flickers. Not animals, not strangers exactly. People, though different. What do? Trade, fight, flee, or approach slowly, spear-lowered, curiosity outweighing fear? Evidence suggests that all of these happened. In some cases, there may have been conflict. Competition for the same prey, the same caves, the same waterholes could turn violent. Archaeological layers sometimes show abrupt shifts in tool styles, suggesting one group displacing another, but there were also moments of exchange. In some Levantine caves you find Sapien-style ornaments mixed with Neanderthal-style tools, as if traditions overlapped, ideas swapped back and forth. Picture a firelit evening where someone shows someone else a new way to carve a blade, while children play together nearby. And then, of course, there were unions. Genetic evidence makes it undeniable. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred. If you are of European or Asian descent, you carry between 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. That means your ancestors didn't just meet, they paired, they had children, they blended. Denisovans, too, left their marks, with up to 5% of DNA in modern Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians. These weren't one-night encounters, they happened repeatedly, across regions, over thousands of years. Each child born of those meetings carried genes that still circulate in your bloodstream. Here's your first joke for this section. Imagine the world's first awkward family introduction. Mum, Dad, this is my partner. Yes, he's Neanderthal, but have you seen those shoulders? But let's not romanticize too much. These were small populations, and interbreeding may have been as much about necessity as affection. In harsh climates, with limited numbers, finding a mate wasn't about preferences, it was about survival. Still, the fact remains, barriers weren't absolute, lines blurred, families formed, and legacies endured. Denisovans, though less known, show an even more surprising picture. Their DNA reveals not one, but multiple interbreeding events, with Homo sapiens. In fact, some populations seem to have encountered different Denisovan groups in different regions, suggesting Denisovans themselves were diverse. Imagine traveling across Asia and meeting cousins who looked similar, but not identical, each adapted to their particular environments, each leaving their mark in your lineage. These meetings weren't just biological, they were cultural too. When Homo sapiens arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago, they brought with them blade tools, bone needles, art, ornaments. Neanderthals, already experimenting with these things, may have learned, borrowed, or adapted. Some sites show sudden innovations in Neanderthal toolkits shortly after contact, as if inspiration or imitation flowed across the fire gap. You can almost see the scene, a Neanderthal handling a sapien's bone needle, eyebrows raising in admiration, then quietly replicating the idea back at camp. And food, the universal connector, may have been shared too. Both species hunted similar game, gathered similar plants. Perhaps a joint hunt happened, an elk brought down together, meat divided, grudging respect earned. Or perhaps the reverse, snarls over carcasses, spears raised, blood spilled, every possibility played out, because humans in all their forms are complicated. Second joke for the section: imagine the first time a Homo sapiens shared roasted tubers with a Neanderthal. The Neanderthal takes a bite, chews thoughtfully, then grunts, needs more mammoth fat. Culinary criticism, Ice Age style. What's striking is how much these meetings mattered for the future. Without Neanderthals and Denisovans, Homo sapiens might not have survived as well in new environments. Their genes gave modern humans boosts in immunity, metabolism, and adaptation. At high altitudes, for example, Tibetans thrive thanks to Denisovan DNA. Some immune responses to pathogens, both helpful and harmful, are linked to Neanderthal DNA. Your body today is a living museum of those encounters. But what was it like emotionally, socially, personally? You'll never know for sure, but you can guess. Curiosity must have been strong, fear too, perhaps desire, maybe even friendship. Imagine the conversations around fires, the laughter at clumsy gestures, the tentative trust built one shared hunt at a time. These weren't faceless encounters, they were human moments, rich and messy. Archaeological hints show Neanderthals lingered longest in southern Spain, long after Homo sapiens spread across Europe. Did they watch newcomers take over? Did they avoid them, hide in dwindling refuges, or attempt alliances? Denisovans too may have held out in remote parts of Asia, their traces slowly fading into mixed populations. It wasn't a clean replacement, it was a complex mingling, sometimes tragic, sometimes generative. Third joke of the section: picture a Neanderthal elder telling their clan, "Don't get involved with those sapiens, they're trouble." Meanwhile, the younger one sneaks off to meet a sapiens partner by the river, Romeo and Juliet 50,000 BCE edition. And so the contact between sapiens, Neanderthals and Denisovans was never one-dimensional. It was conflict and cooperation, violence and intimacy, competition and connection. Each meeting left echoes that resonate still, in your bones, in your blood, in the very cells that keep you alive. When you close your eyes now, you see two fires burning on a windswept plain. Around one sit Neanderthals, their voices low, their eyes reflecting flame. Around the other sit Homo sapiens, their ornaments glinting, their tools sharp. Slowly, cautiously, one figure rises, carrying a piece of roasted meat. He walks across the darkness, places it near the other fire. For a moment, silence reigns. Then a hand reaches out, accepts it. Two branches of humanity meet, and history bends. You tilt your head as if to listen inside your own blood, because the next part of the story isn't painted on a cave wall or buried in a hearth of ash. It's alive within you. When your saliva dampens a cotton swab for a DNA test, you're calling Neanderthals and Denisovans out of the shadows. They aren't ghosts you read about in textbooks. They are quiet tenants in your genome. They still weigh in on how your skin handles winter, how you fight infection, how your lungs adapt to altitude, even how easily you doze when the firelight dies. You are not a clean slate of Homo sapiens, you are a patchwork. The proof began less than 2 decades ago. In 2010, researchers published the first Neanderthal genome, painstakingly coaxed from fragile bones found in Croatian caves. The Denisovan genome followed, teased from a single pinky bone and a couple of teeth in the Altai Mountains. Ancient DNA is fragile, broken into short damaged threads by thousands of years of decay. Sequencing it is like trying to read a burned, water-stained manuscript through the holes. But once assembled, those sequences could be compared to ours. Wherever living people carried stretches that matched Neanderthals or Denisovans more closely than they matched other modern humans, the conclusion was clear: we had mixed. If your family roots trace to Europe or Asia, you likely carry about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. If you trace to Papua New Guinea, Melanesia, or Aboriginal Australia, you may carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Most Africans carry little, though later back migration from Eurasia brought in faint echoes. No one today holds the Neanderthal genome complete, but if you add up the different pieces scattered among billions of humans, between a third and 2/5 of it still walks around inside us. Your 2% and your neighbor's 2% are not the same 2%. Together, humanity is a Neanderthal library on legs. Those pieces don't lie in random spots. Recombination, the natural shuffling of DNA each generation, slices the archaic contributions into smaller and smaller tracks. After 50,000 years, most surviving chunks are short mosaics buried deep in chromosomes, yet some regions are barren of archaic DNA, deserts where selection scrubbed them away. These include parts of the X chromosome and genes tied to fertility and early development. The absence suggests incompatibilities. Hybrids were viable, but some combinations of ancient and modern didn't work well, so time pared them down. Elsewhere, though, the gifts endured. On the Tibetan plateau, people breathe thin air with a calm that would leave you reeling. The reason is EPAS1, a gene variant inherited from Denisovans, which tones down overreaction to low oxygen. In the Arctic, the Denisovan-derived block in TBX-15 Wars 2 influences how brown fat and body shape manage cold. Neanderthal DNA altered keratin genes, shaping hair and skin responses to climate. Look in a mirror in winter. The way your skin dries, freckles or tans, is partly their design. Immunity shows the strongest fingerprints. Toll-like receptor genes borrowed from Neanderthals sharpen the innate immune system's ability to spot bacteria. OAS genes help cells shred viral RNA. HLA alleles, the name tags immune cells use to identify intruders, sometimes arrived from archaic sources. These upgrades mattered when sapiens left Africa and met Eurasian pathogens for the first time. The bargain wasn't free, though. The same hyper-alert immune settings raise risks of allergies and autoimmune conditions today. Here's your first joke of the section. If you've ever boasted, "I'm built for the mountains," a Denisovan somewhere is rolling their eyes and muttering, "Say thank you." Metabolism bears traces too. A Neanderthal-derived variant of SLC16A11, common in the Americas, affects fat processing and links today to a higher risk of type 2 diabetes. In an Ice Age pantry of lean meat and scarce carbs, it was likely a thrifty boon. Other archaic variants shape vitamin D synthesis, alcohol breakdown, and fat storage. Neanderthal DNA did not anticipate donuts. Even behavior carries echoes. Studies show some Neanderthal fragments influence chronotype, whether you lean night owl or morning lark. Others touch pain sensitivity, nicotine dependence, even mood under stress. These are nudges, not destinies. Tiny weights on your habits, but picture it. A cousin thousands of years ago, eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the fire, keeping watch while others slept. Night owls may be an ancient inheritance. Second joke for the section. Population geneticists seriously named a key test, bobai. Imagine explaining to a Neanderthal, "Yes, we figured out you're our cousin with the help of a Swedish pop group, and then there are the mysteries." Some DNA in modern Southeast Asians doesn't match Neanderthals or Denisovans exactly. It hints at other archaic groups, ghost populations we haven't yet found in bone but can see in genetic shadows. Asia may once have been a patchwork of cousin clans now melted into us, their names forgotten but their code still running. Adaptive introgression, the technical phrase for borrowing what worked, was crucial. Without it, Homo sapiens might have stumbled in alien climates. Instead, we inherited pre-tested solutions: altitude tolerance, cold resilience, stronger immune defenses. We also inherited liabilities, allergies, metabolic quirks, stubborn risks. Evolution doesn't hand out clean upgrades. It deals in trade-offs. Third joke for the section. You know those ancestry reports that say 2% Neanderthal? Imagine if they added footnotes. Package includes thicker skin, slightly odd sleep schedule, occasional grumpiness. So you are a mosaic. One tile sapiens, another Neanderthal, another Denisovan, a hidden piece from a ghost cousin. Your genome is a patchwork cloak stitched in Ice Age fires. Some seams are frayed, some patches discarded, but the cloak endures, keeping you alive. And tonight, as you breathe slow and steady, those quiet threads still hum with ancient purpose, keeping the fire inside your body burning, as they always have. You walk now into a valley where herds move like rivers of muscle and horn, and suddenly the reality of coexistence sharpens. These landscapes didn't have enough to go around. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo sapiens all needed the same things: meat from mammoth, deer or bison, tubers and nuts from the ground, caves for shelter, wood for fire. Competition was unavoidable. Every carcass on the tundra, every fishing spot on the riverbank, every berry thicket in summer was a prize someone else also wanted. You can almost hear the tension in the crackling frost, the awareness that too many hands were reaching for too few resources. Neanderthals had ruled these hunting grounds for hundreds of thousands of years. They knew the migration routes of animals, the choke points where rivers narrowed, the cliffs where panicked herds might fall. Their strategies were sophisticated: coordinated drives, ambushes, and close quarters thrusts with heavy spears. When Homo sapiens arrived, however, the rules of the game began to change. The newcomers brought long-range weapons, atlals and later bows, and more flexible hunting groups. Instead of risking their lives inches from bison horns, they could strike from a distance. Efficiency multiplied. Prey that once fell reliably to Neanderthal tactics could be harvested faster and more safely by sapiens. Denisovans, spread across Asia, faced similar contests. Imagine them in the mountains of Central Asia, adapted to thin air, stalking ibex across cliffs. Then picture Homo sapiens climbing into the same ranges, leaner, carrying lighter blades, communicating in rapid bursts of symbolic language. Both groups wanted the same herds, the same high passes, the same sheltering caves. Coexistence was possible for a time, but every overlap meant stress on food supplies, and it wasn't only animals. Plants, fuel, and territory mattered. In glacial winters, wood for fire was as precious as meat. A cave could hold one group, but rarely two. The very geology of Europe and Asia became contested real estate. Each valley, each waterhole, each shelter was a coin flipped. Who would get it this season? Who would starve? Who would move on? Survival wasn't just about clever tools. It was about timing, arriving before someone else did. Here's your first joke for this section. Ice Age real estate agents must have had the hardest job. Location: south-facing cave, comes with mammoth bone doorframe, great view of the valley. Downsides: occasional cave bear. Still, competition didn't always mean violence. Archaeological sites suggest Neanderthals and sapiens sometimes lived in adjacent regions for thousands of years, with boundaries shifting slowly. Think of it less as a single clash and more as a long squeeze. Homo sapiens' larger social networks meant they could draw support from wider kin groups, moving resources across distances. Neanderthals, more locally tied, may have struggled when prey declined or when disease spread. The same was likely true for Denisovans in Asia, competing with multiple waves of migrating sapiens. Ecology played its role with ruthless impartiality. Two apex predators in one environment create pressure until one adapts better or disappears. Neanderthals had shorter, stockier builds perfect for cold, but less efficient for long-distance pursuits. Homo sapiens had taller frames, longer legs, better for covering ground. Endurance running, chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion, was a sapiens specialty. Picture it, a group of sapiens trotting relentlessly after a deer for hours, while Neanderthals waited in ambush at closer quarters. Two strategies, both effective, but one could cover more territory. Over time, more territory meant more food. Denisovans may have faced similar constraints. High-altitude adaptations gave them an edge in the mountains, but Homo sapiens' versatility allowed them to sweep across deserts, forests, coasts. Where Denisovans specialized, sapiens improvised, and improvisation tends to win the long game. Second joke of the section: imagine a Neanderthal complaining, "Every time I go to the Good Hunting Valley, there's already a sapiens there. Do they ever rest?" Answer: nope. They were basically the ultramarathoners of prehistory. And yet, the picture wasn't absolute displacement. Interbreeding shows that meetings weren't always hostile. Genes flowed both ways, and sometimes cooperation must have happened. Perhaps Neanderthals traded hides for seashells brought inland by sapiens. Perhaps Denisovans taught sapiens safe mountain passes. Still, as numbers grew, the math of survival tilted. A bigger sapiens network could absorb losses, replenish hunters, and shift strategies. For smaller Neanderthal and Denisovan groups, every lost hunt, every sickness, every harsh winter had sharper consequence. Competition also extended into subtle niches. Sapiens may have eaten more varied diets, drawing on fish, birds, and small game that Neanderthals didn't exploit as much. Flexibility meant less direct overlap in resources, but it also meant sapiens could thrive where Neanderthals struggled. The same with tools. Lighter projectiles meant sapiens could exploit new hunting zones. Denisovans likely experienced similar squeezes in Asia, edged into narrower ranges as sapiens expanded. Third joke for the section: imagine a Denisovan muttering, "I liked this valley before it was popular," basically the world's first hipster complaint. The heart of the matter is simple. Three kinds of humans shared the planet, but not comfortably. Each had strengths, each had mastery of their environment, but their needs overlapped too closely. Over tens of thousands of years, that overlap eroded the footholds of Neanderthals and Denisovans. They weren't doomed by design, they were pressured by circumstance, by competition, by the relentless arithmetic of survival. And tonight, as you watch the herds fade into the mist, and the hunters tighten their grips on spears, you feel the tension of that competition. Every choice mattered: which trail to follow, which prey to chase, which cave to claim. In that world, survival wasn't just about strength. It was about timing, adaptability, and the simple, merciless question: who gets to eat and who goes hungry? The wind sharpens, and you hunch your shoulders against it, because now the story isn't just about competition with each other, it's about wrestling against the moods of the planet itself. Climate in the Ice Age world was not a steady background, it was a mercurial force, shifting gears in sudden jolts. One century a landscape could be open grassland with herds grazing, the next buried under ice. Neanderthals and Denisovans lived through these upheavals, but each swing demanded a recalibration of survival. Eventually, the swings came too fast, too severe, and they chipped away at populations already stretched thin. The Pleistocene epoch, spanning from about 2.6 million to 11,700 years ago, was a rhythm of glacial advances and retreats. For Neanderthals in Europe, this meant a constant dance with the ice sheets. During warm interglacials, forests spread, rivers flowed, game roamed in plenty, but when glaciers surged south, temperatures plunged, vegetation shrank, prey migrated or vanished, and survival narrowed to desperate edges. You walk into one of those cold snaps now. Wind howls, snow crusts the steppe, herds have moved far south, and every breath feels like knives. Denisovans in Asia faced similar pressures, though their environments varied more. Some lived in high mountains, where climate meant brutal cold year-round. Others ranged in forests and plains, where monsoon patterns shifted, rivers swelled or dried, and food webs wavered. When weather turned unstable, groups had to move, but moving meant clashing with neighbors or entering landscapes they weren't adapted to. Climate wasn't just a natural backdrop, it was a trigger for conflict. One famous pulse, the Heinrich events, saw great chunks of icebergs breaking into the North Atlantic, disrupting currents, plunging Europe into sudden deep freezes. These weren't gradual changes but generational shocks. A Neanderthal child born into a relatively mild valley might grow up into an adult who faced an unlivable tundra, and in small, scattered populations, a few bad winters could thin numbers dangerously. Here's your first joke of the section. If Neanderthals had weather apps, they'd all just say, "Cold again, pack extra mammoth fat." Not much of a forecast, but accurate. What made climate swings lethal wasn't only temperature. Prey animals shifted their ranges, often unpredictably. If herds of bison or horses suddenly migrated out of reach, Neanderthal or Denisovan hunters faced hunger, waterholes dried, rivers froze solid, forests collapsed into scrub. For a population of just a few dozen individuals, even one failed hunting season could cascade into disaster. Homo sapiens, with wider trade and social networks, could offset shortages by pulling resources from elsewhere. Neanderthals and Denisovans with smaller webs had fewer buffers. The archaeological record bears scars of these changes. At some sites, layers show long use of a cave, half after half, bones of prey stacked in abundance. Then suddenly, silence. No fires, no bones, no humans. The people didn't vanish into thin air. They were pushed out by shifting climates, leaving only traces of soot to mark their presence. And yet Neanderthals and Denisovans weren't passive victims. They adapted again and again. They followed migrating animals. They shifted diets to include more plants and small game. They endured cold snaps by retreating into southern refuges. Iberia, the Balkans, the Caucasus, parts of Central Asia. For hundreds of thousands of years they bent with the climate's blows and carried on. Their extinction wasn't the result of a single storm, but of many storms stacked atop each other, chipping away resilience. Denisovans may have even benefited from their environments at times. High-altitude adaptations allowed them to survive where others could not, but such niches were fragile. If ecosystems collapsed or prey dwindled, their specialization could turn into a trap. Imagine thriving on the Tibetan plateau for generations, then watching as cold snaps drive herds away and leave only barren stone. Where do you go? Second joke of the section. Neanderthal dinner table talk probably went, "Remember when winters used to be mild?" And everyone groaned, "Okay, Grandpa, here we go again." Climatic instability also meant stress on reproduction. In bad years, pregnancies failed, children starved, elders weakened, populations already small became smaller. Genetic diversity shrank, making groups less resilient to disease or further environmental shocks. When Homo sapiens arrived, carrying larger networks, greater adaptability, and broader diets, the playing field tipped. Climate didn't destroy Neanderthals and Denisovans alone, but it was the background drumbeat weakening them with every beat. Consider too the psychological toll. Imagine being a Neanderthal elder, remembering valleys once lush with game, now barren. You watch children grow thin, you see clans fracture as some leave to seek better land. Hope must have flickered like firelight, bright in moments, but fragile in the storms, and the storms were relentless. Between 60,000 and 40,000 years ago, Europe saw repeated climate swings, warm, then freezing, then warm again. Each swing shrank Neanderthal range, compressed them into refuges, reduced their numbers. Denisovans likely experienced similar squeezes in Asia, and just as these stresses mounted, Homo sapiens arrived, adding competition to crisis. The timing was devastating. Third joke of the section, picture a Denisovan muttering, "Honestly, I could handle the cold, but did the sapiens really have to show up right when the mammoths left?" Rude. As you walk through this Ice Age landscape, snow crunching underfoot, you feel the weight of climate, not as abstract science, but as daily, bone-deep reality. It wasn't a gentle background shift, it was a constant test. Adapt, move, starve or die. Neanderthals and Denisovans passed that test again and again, until one day, their luck, their numbers, and their options ran out. The wind howls louder, and you pull the furs tighter in your imagination. This is what it meant to live at the mercy of climate. Never certain, never stable, always one winter away from extinction, and in that fragile uncertainty, your cousins held on as long as they could. You find yourself standing in a windswept gorge where the echoes of voices don't multiply, because there were never many to begin with. The stark truth about Neanderthals and Denisovans is that their populations were never large. They lived in small, scattered groups, sometimes just a few dozen individuals clinging together against the cold. Population size and isolation weren't footnotes to their story. They were the central vulnerability that made every other pressure, from climate to competition, so much heavier. Estimates suggest the total Neanderthal population at any given time may have been only in the tens of thousands spread across all of Europe and Western Asia. Imagine it, an entire continent, and fewer people than fit into a modern sports stadium. Denisovans, whose range stretched from Siberia to Southeast Asia, may have been similarly thin on the ground. These weren't sprawling civilizations with buffers and reserves. They were intimate, fragile webs of kin, every individual a thread that mattered. When groups are this small, genetic diversity shrinks. Inbreeding becomes inevitable. DNA studies show that some Neanderthals were startlingly inbred. One genome from Siberia revealed parents who were close relatives, maybe half-siblings or uncle and niece. It's not because they didn't know better, it's because the pool of options was just too shallow. Small populations mean limited choices, and with inbreeding comes risk. Harmful mutations pile up, fertility drops, resilience weakens. Over generations that fragility compounds. Now picture a clan of 25 huddled in a cave. Through winter, a flu-like illness spreads. Coughing echoes in the dark, and 3 members die. That's more than 10% of your group gone. One hunter falls from a cliff and breaks his leg beyond healing. Another vital provider lost. The child starves during a lean season. Suddenly, you're down to 18. Each loss isn't just tragedy, it's a blow to the entire group's survival odds. Here's your first joke of the section. Neanderthal Census Day must have been depressing. Head count? Still 27 of us, unless Bjorn wandered off again. Contrast that with Homo sapiens. When sapiens expanded out of Africa, they moved in larger networks, tied together by trade, language, and alliances. If one group faltered, others could absorb survivors. Neanderthals and Denisovans lacked this broader safety net. Their isolation was geographic as much as social. Valleys, rivers, and glaciers cut them off from one another. A band in Spain might live and die without ever meeting a band in Croatia. Knowledge shared in one place could vanish with its carriers. The archaeological record hints at this isolation. Tool traditions remained remarkably stable over tens of thousands of years, passed down within small groups, changing slowly. Compare that with sapiens, whose innovations, bone needles, fishing gear, symbolic ornaments, spread like wildfire across continents. The difference wasn't intelligence, it was connectivity. A small group cut off in a valley can only invent so much. A larger network, constantly mingling, can exchange, adapt, and refine. Isolation also amplified environmental shocks. A harsh winter could wipe out an entire group, leaving no one to carry their lineage. A sudden shift in prey migration could starve a valley into silence. Unlike sapiens, Neanderthals and Denisovans couldn't easily draw reinforcements from distant kin. Their world was made of fragile bubbles, each one at risk of popping. And yet, within these bubbles, life was deeply communal. Everyone mattered. Elders carried memory of hunting grounds. Mothers passed down techniques of scraping hides. Children learned flint knapping by watching injured members were cared for. Skeletons show healed fractures that would have required months of support. Compassion was a survival strategy in groups this small. You don't leave someone behind, because every hand is needed, every life a thread in the fabric. Second joke of the section. Imagine a Neanderthal version of family drama. With only 20 people in your world, every argument is Thanksgiving dinner turned up to 11. No escape, no new friends, just the same faces, every single day for years. For Denisovans, the story was similar but stretched across vaster distances. Their genetic legacy reveals that they weren't a single homogeneous group, but a patchwork of populations across Asia. Some were close relatives of Neanderthals, others more distinct, but each seems to have been small, isolated, shaped by local conditions. In Papua New Guinea's ancestry, you see traces of one Denisovan group, in Tibet, traces of another. They were widespread but rarely numerous, like lanterns flickering across a dark steppe. Each glow was fragile, easily extinguished. This fragility shows in the modern genetic record. While we carry Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, we don't carry all of it. Vast portions of their genomes vanished with their small populations. It's as if whole chapters of their story were burned, leaving only fragments scattered in your own cells. Third joke for the section. If Neanderthals had dating apps, the options would have been bleak. Welcome back. It's still just your cousin, Ingrid. Swipe right, or starve. The tragedy is clear. Neanderthals and Denisovans weren't wiped out in a sudden apocalypse. They ebbed away, group by group, valley by valley, until silence spread. Small population size meant every setback cut deeper. Every winter loomed larger. Every birth and death tipped the balance. Isolation meant that when one group vanished, their knowledge, songs, and stories vanished with them. You look around this gorge again, listening to the echoes fade, and you realize their disappearance wasn't only about Homo sapiens outcompeting them. It was about the vulnerability of being too few, too scattered, too fragile in a world that demanded resilience. They lived, they endured, but they could not weather every blow, and so, thread by thread, their tapestry unraveled. The trail of footprints before you shifts shape. The broad, sturdy prints of Neanderthals begin to fade, and alongside them appear longer, narrower tracks. Homo sapiens. To understand why your branch eventually pulled ahead while your cousins dwindled, you need to look closely at the subtle but decisive advantages Homo sapiens carried. None of these were about brute strength. In fact, Neanderthals often had the edge in muscle and raw power, but sapiens had other tools, invisible ones, that proved decisive over time. The first was social networking. Not the online kind, though. You can almost hear a Neanderthal rolling their eyes at the concept of TikTok. This was about linking groups into larger webs of exchange. Archaeological evidence shows Homo sapiens traded shells, pigments, and stone across distances of hundreds of kilometers. A band in one valley had connections to another band far away, and through them to another beyond that. If food failed in one region, alliances could provide relief. If a new tool was invented, it could spread quickly through the network. Neanderthals, by contrast, lived in smaller, more isolated groups with limited exchange. When disaster struck, they faced it alone. The second edge was symbolic communication. Homo sapiens had language with greater complexity, nuance, and speed. You could coordinate a hunt with intricate strategies, tell stories that taught lessons, invent myths that bound groups together. Symbols extended beyond speech, beads, carvings, painted animals on cave walls. Each object reinforced identity and cohesion. This symbolic glue helped build larger, more cooperative societies. Neanderthals could speak, yes, but evidence suggests sapiens used language and symbolism more expansively, turning communication into a survival engine. Third, sapiens were tinkerers. Their toolkits show constant innovation: bone needles for sewing fitted clothes, fish hooks for exploiting rivers and coasts, throwing spears and dactyls for safer hunting, eventually bows and arrows. Neanderthal tools were effective, but changed little over long stretches. When conditions shifted, Homo sapiens adapted their toolkit rapidly, exploiting new niches. That flexibility meant they could survive in deserts, forests, tundras, and coasts alike. Neanderthals and Denisovans specialized brilliantly in their environments, but specializations can become traps when the world changes. Here's your first joke of this section. Imagine Homo sapiens showing up to a Neanderthal camp with a bone needle. "Check it out," fitted pants, and the Neanderthals mutter, "Show-offs." Art and ritual also gave sapiens an advantage, not just for beauty but for resilience. Shared songs, dances, and myths reinforced group identity, making cooperation easier across larger scales. A Neanderthal group of 25 might cooperate tightly, but a sapiens network of 200 could cooperate at regional scales, creating safety nets too wide for scarcity to unravel. Numbers mattered. Sapiens groups were larger, healthier, and more genetically diverse. They could absorb losses without collapsing. Their broader mating networks reduced inbreeding risks. They also had higher fertility rates, perhaps tied to slightly different life histories. Sapiens women may have spaced births closer together, producing more children over a lifetime. Over tens of thousands of years, even a small fertility edge adds up to overwhelming numbers. Dietary breadth was another factor. While Neanderthals excelled at big game hunting, sapiens were omnivorous opportunists. They ate fish, birds, shellfish, nuts, berries, small mammals, anything edible. In coastal sites, sapiens feasted on seafood. In rivers, they trapped fish. They dug roots, ground seeds, and stored food in ways Neanderthals didn't. When mammoth herds disappeared, sapiens still had fallback foods. Neanderthals, locked into specialized strategies, starved. Denisovans faced similar comparisons. Their adaptations were impressive: high-altitude genes, robust bodies, but their record shows less evidence of expansive innovation or trade. Sapiens' restlessness carried them across oceans, into Australia by 65,000 years ago, into the Americas much later. Denisovans remained tied to niches. That difference spelled the gap between survival and disappearance. Second joke of the section: you can picture a Denisovan staring at a sapiens raft heading out to sea, muttering, "That'll never work." Fast forward, and the sapiens are eating coconuts on a beach in Australia. Even sapiens' relationship with dogs may have played a role. Evidence suggests early domestication of wolves by Homo sapiens provided hunting partners, guardians, and warmth. Imagine facing a cave bear with a spear alone versus with a wolf at your side. Small advantages stack into big ones. Cognition and creativity also mattered. Sapiens could imagine possibilities, plan ahead, invent solutions, and share them widely. They made nets, traps, and containers. They built shelters with more complexity, created storage pits, organized camps into functional spaces. Neanderthals were intelligent, but sapiens were more relentlessly inventive, always probing for new strategies. That restless imagination, combined with broader cooperation, tipped the scale, and so, across millennia, sapiens spread and multiplied, while Neanderthals and Denisovans shrank, not because they were weaker, but because sapiens had edges in numbers, networks, innovation, and adaptability. In a world of shifting climate and scarce resources, those edges compounded into dominance. Third joke of the section. Imagine Neanderthals seeing Homo sapiens painting animals on cave walls and asking, "Does that help you hunt?" And sapiens replying, "Not really, but it looks cool." Neanderthals walk away muttering, "We're doomed." As you walk among the echoes of these vanished cousins, you realize it wasn't a contest of superiority in the way old textbooks once claimed. Neanderthals and Denisovans were successful humans, thriving for hundreds of thousands years, but sapiens carried subtle advantages that turned survival into expansion, until one day your branch was the only one left. The footprints before you stretch onward, Neanderthal tracks fading, Denisovan shadows dissolving, sapien steps multiplying across continents. And with each step, the story leans toward its inevitable, but not predestined outcome. The firelight of Neanderthal camps flickers low as you step into their final centuries. For more than 300,000 years, they had ruled Europe and Western Asia, weathering ice and thaw, predators and prey, solitude and survival. Yet by about 40,000 years ago, their story was winding towards silence. This wasn't a sudden vanishing like a comet striking. It was a slow retreat, a dwindling of clans and a narrowing of ranges, until the last Neanderthal fires guttered out in caves on the Iberian Peninsula. The archaeological record gives you glimpses of those last days. In caves from France to Croatia, you find layers of Mousterian tools abruptly replaced by the blades and ornaments of Homo sapiens. For tens of millennia, Neanderthals and sapiens coexisted in Europe, sometimes side by side, sometimes worlds apart. But after about 42,000 years ago, Neanderthal sites grow scarce. By 39,000, only a few enclaves remain. By 37,000, their presence is gone. A span of time that seems long to you, thousands of years, was but a blink in their deep history. What happened in those twilight years? Climate had already battered them, shrinking habitable zones. Competition with sapiens pressed harder, with larger sapiens groups claiming prey and territory. But another factor was numbers. Neanderthal populations were already small. Genetic evidence shows inbreeding and low diversity, weakening resilience. When their groups dwindled further, recovery became impossible. A few bad winters, a few epidemics, and a lineage could vanish. Imagine one of those last enclaves, somewhere in southern Spain, where the climate was milder and game still lingered. A band of 20 Neanderthals sits around a fire. They know the valleys beyond are full of strange newcomers, taller, ornamented, with different tools and different songs. They avoid them, keeping to their caves, watching from afar. But each year, the prey is harder to find. Children die young, elders grow weary, births don't keep pace with deaths. Slowly, the band shrinks. One winter the fire is left untended, and the cave falls silent. Here's your first joke for this section. If Neanderthals had written Yelp reviews of Homo sapiens moving into the neighborhood, it would have been 1 star. Too many people, too much noise, stole our hunting grounds. But not all contact was hostile. Some of the last Neanderthals interbred with Homo sapiens, leaving traces of their genes in us. The legacy of their final generations isn't only bones but living DNA. In a way, they didn't disappear completely, they were absorbed. Still, as distinct communities, they were gone. The last sparks of a long, fierce flame faded into the broader fire of humanity. The disappearance wasn't uniform. Some regions held on longer than others. Gibraltar may have been one of the last refuges. Caves like Gorham's show Neanderthal presence perhaps, as late as 32,000 years ago. Picture them clinging to the rocky shoreline, hunting ibex on cliffs, gathering shellfish. These were the final holdouts, the last lanterns against encroaching dark. Their lives looked much the same as they had for millennia, hunting, scraping hides, raising children, but around them the world was changing irrevocably. Second joke of the section. Imagine a Neanderthal on the cliffs of Gibraltar, looking out at the sea and muttering, "At least there aren't any sapiens out there." Meanwhile, sapiens are already building rafts somewhere else. Why did they not survive when sapiens did? Some scholars suggest sapiens had broader social safety nets, better adapted diets, and greater innovation. Others argue diseases brought by sapiens may have cut through Neanderthal groups, but perhaps the truth is simpler. They were just too few. In a contest of tens of thousands versus hundreds of thousands, the math itself became merciless, and yet there's poignancy in their end. Neanderthals endured far longer than modern civilization has existed. They thrived in Ice Age Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, adapting, enduring, raising families. To call them failures is absurd. They were masters of their world. Their disappearance wasn't a failure of intelligence or strength. It was the outcome of pressures they could not escape, compounded by small numbers and relentless competition. Third joke of the section. If Neanderthals could send one last message to sapiens, it might be, "Fine, you win, but don't screw it up." Looking at climate change and wars today, you wonder if we really listened. When you close your eyes now, you see their last fires glowing dim in coastal caves, children's laughter fading into silence, footprints in sand washed away by tides. The Neanderthals didn't vanish in one dramatic event. They dwindled, absorbed, remembered only faintly in the strands of your DNA. They were here, they mattered, and though their voices no longer echo in caves, a whisper of them still speaks in you. Now you turn east, toward mountains that stab into the sky, and forests that once stretched without end. For here lived the most elusive of your cousins, the Denisovans. If Neanderthals' decline is painted in a fading mural across Europe, Denisovans' story is more like ink spilled on a map, wide, scattered, but quickly soaked into the fabric of other peoples until their outlines blurred. Unlike Neanderthals, who left behind skeletons and caves full of tools, Denisovans remain mostly shadows in your DNA and a handful of bones in Siberia. And yet, their disappearance was no less real. Denisovans thrived for tens of thousands of years across Asia. They adapted to high-altitude plateaus, to cold Siberian steppes, perhaps even to the humid forests of Southeast Asia. But around 30,000 years ago, maybe earlier in some regions, their distinct presence begins to vanish. We don't have the same clear archaeological trail as with Neanderthals, but their fading can be read in absence. Their bones stop appearing. Their tools, if we can confidently identify them, vanish from layers of caves. And yet, their genes remain, proof that before disappearing, they mingled with Homo sapiens in intimate, lasting ways. Imagine the last enclaves of Denisovans in the Altai Mountains. Winter snows weigh heavy on pine branches, rivers freeze solid, and hunters stalk ibex along cliffs. Their world is harsh, but they are adapted. Still, pressures mount. Climate shifts shrink habitable zones. Prey animals migrate, and then, as if on cue, new people arrive. Homo sapiens with their broader diets, larger groups, and faster spreading innovations. For Denisovans, already few in number, every arrival squeezes harder. Unlike Neanderthals, Denisovans didn't leave us cave paintings or carved ornaments we can firmly assign to them. Their disappearance is therefore even more spectral. Were they absorbed directly into sapiens groups, their identities dissolving like salt in water, or were they slowly starved out, their refugees shrinking until only hybrids remained? Genetic evidence suggests both. Different populations in Asia today carry traces of different Denisovan groups, meaning there wasn't just one extinction, but several fade-outs, one population after another, absorbed or extinguished. Here's your first joke of the section. Imagine a Denisovan ghost sighing, "Great, I vanish without a trace, and the only thing you remember me for is your oxygen tolerance." In Tibet, the high-altitude gene IPAS1 remains one of their greatest legacies. Without it, sapiens might have struggled to colonize Himalayan plateaus. In Oceania, Denisovan DNA shaped immune systems and body adaptations. Their disappearance wasn't clean. They lingered in human bloodstreams, hidden but powerful. But as a distinct people, they became invisible. Picture a Denisovan mother watching her children grow up alongside sapiens newcomers. Perhaps they learned words from each other, shared food, even intermarried. Within 2 or 3 generations, the lines blurred. Her grandchildren spoke the sapiens language, carried mixed features, and in time no longer thought of themselves as anything separate. That's not conquest in the sword and shield sense. It's disappearance by blending. And yet, not all blending is gentle. In other valleys, competition may have been brutal. Sapiens groups arriving with projectile weapons could out-hunt Denisovans, leaving them with scraps. Diseases carried by sapiens could have torn through small Denisovan clans, devastating groups too tiny to recover. The archaeological silence across much of Asia suggests not only merging but also loss final and irreversible. Second joke of the section. If Denisovans had a slogan, it might have been, "We put the DNA in you, but forgot to leave a forwarding address." What haunts their story is its incompleteness. Unlike Neanderthals who left hearths, bones and art, Denisovans left gaps. Their final disappearance is harder to dramatize because it looks like vanishing mist. And yet, in another way, it's more intimate. Neanderthals are remembered by stone and pigment. Denisovans are remembered by the code of your cells. You carry them not as relics you can dig up, but as living companions written into your biology. By 30,000 years ago, Denisovans had melted into sapiens populations across Asia and Oceania. Their unique identity dissolved, their voices lost, their bones few. Unlike Neanderthals, who held out as distinct groups to the end, Denisovans may never have had a dramatic last stand. They simply became part of us until nothing separate remained. It's extinction, yes, but extinction by absorption. Third joke of the section. Picture a Denisovan looking at your 23andMe results today and muttering, 2%, you're welcome. That'll be... And so, the Denisovan story closes, not with firelight fading in caves, but with their blood pulsing in your veins. Their disappearance was not annihilation, but transformation. They're gone as a people, but not entirely gone. Every breath a Tibetan takes at altitude, every immune response in a Melanesian body, is a quiet Denisovan echo. Their disappearance is paradoxical. They vanished, yet they endure, hidden not in caves or bones, but in the living flesh of modern humanity. You pause now and look inward, because this part of the story is not about what was lost, but about what remains. Though Neanderthals and Denisovans disappeared as distinct peoples, they left souvenirs in your very cells, pieces of themselves stitched into the quilt of modern humanity. They live on, not in caves or tools, but in your blood, your skin, your breath. What remains of them today is not silence, but whispers that guide how you adapt, how you survive, even how you dream. Let's start with the obvious. DNA. About 1 to 2% of the genome in people of European and Asian descent comes from Neanderthals. In Melanesians, Aboriginal Australians and some Southeast Asian groups, up to 5% comes from Denisovans. At first that sounds small, like a footnote, but multiply it across billions of humans and you realize entire genomes worth of archaic DNA are still alive, scattered among us. If you could gather every Neanderthal fragment still carried by living people, you could almost reconstruct their entire genetic code. They're gone, but only in body. And these fragments are not neutral passengers, they still do work. Neanderthal DNA influences your immune system, helping cells recognize and respond to pathogens. Some Neanderthal variants in toll-like receptor genes sharpen defenses against bacteria. Other genes shape keratin production, affecting skin and hair, subtle tweaks that once helped in cold, harsh climates. The Denisovan contribution is even more striking. The EPAS1 gene, found in Tibetans, allows the body to function at high altitudes without overproducing red blood cells. Without that gift, many Himalayan communities would gasp for breath. Denisovans are not gone from those mountains. They breathe through every climber who survives there. Here's your first joke of the section. Every time someone brags, "I can handle the cold," a Neanderthal ancestor somewhere whispers, "You're welcome." But not all gifts are blessings. Some Neanderthal DNA is linked to modern health risks. Variants increase susceptibility to allergies, depression, even nicotine addiction. That's evolution's bargain. What helped in Ice Age Europe may not suit a modern world of central heating and cigarettes. Similarly, a Denisovan variant in fat metabolism that once aided survival in cold environments now increases the risk of diabetes. Your cousins gave you tools, but the world changed around them. Beyond genes, there's culture. Though you can't prove direct transmission, some archaeologists suggest that early symbolic behavior in Homo sapiens may have been sparked by interactions with Neanderthals. Shared ornaments, pigments, burial practices. Ideas don't stay locked in one group. When cousins met, they swapped more than DNA. They swapped inspiration. The art on your walls, the jewelry around your neck, may carry faint echoes of Neanderthal talons, worn as pendants, or Denisovan stone bracelets, polished by hand. Second joke of the section. If Neanderthals knew their DNA would someday be blamed for your seasonal allergies, they'd probably laugh and say, "We gave you fire, tools, and immunity, and you complain about pollen." The legacy is also emotional. Knowing you are part Neanderthal or Denisovan changes how you see yourself. You are not the sole survivor of a pure lineage. You are a mosaic, a blend of branches that once shared the earth. Their disappearance is tragic, but it also means you carry them forward. Every person today is a memorial to the cousins who vanished, whether you realize it or not. Even the concept of resilience is part of their inheritance. The immune boosts, the adaptations, the cultural sparks, these are reminders that humanity's survival was never solitary. We survived together, by borrowing from one another, by blending strengths. The lost cousins didn't vanish without trace. They endured in us. Your lungs, your skin, your cells are the living fossils of their story. Third joke of the section. Next time someone tells you you're acting caveman, you can reply, "Statistically, yes, 1 to 2%. So what remains of them today? Not bodies in caves, though those are precious. Not tools in museums, though those are treasures. What remains is in you, Their disappearance was not total erasure, but transformation. They are gone, yet still here. They whisper through your genes, through your resilience, through your survival. You are their echo, their continuation, their unknowing tribute. And as you lie back now, listening to your own slow breathing, you realize you are not just Homo sapiens, you are the child of many. You are a chorus of ancestors, some remembered, some lost, all still alive in the quiet machinery of your body. The cave grows quieter now, and so does your breathing. We have followed your lost cousins through hundreds of thousands of years, from their emergence out of Homo heidelbergensis, to their spread across icy Europe and mountainous Asia, to their encounters with you, and at last, to their disappearance. And now it is time to sit with the silence they left behind, to reflect on what their story means for your own. Neanderthals and Denisovans were not failures. For hundreds of thousands of years, they thrived. They hunted mammoth and bison, crafted tools with patience, raised children by firelight, buried their dead with care. They endured ice ages, predators, shifting climates. They left art on cave walls, ornaments on bodies, genes in your blood. Their disappearance was not proof of weakness. It was proof of how fragile survival always is. What their loss reveals is the razor's edge of human history. Survival isn't just about being the fittest. It's about timing, numbers, luck, and adaptability. Neanderthals and Denisovans were strong, but their populations were too small, their networks too narrow, their worlds too isolated. When climates swung, when sapiens arrived, when competition tightened, they had no buffer left. Step by step, valley by valley, they ebbed away, and yet they are not gone. You carry them. In your DNA, in your resilience to cold, in your immune system's defenses, in your lungs' quiet ability to breathe at altitude, they live. They endure in the shapes of your cheekbones, the shades of your skin, the rhythms of your body. Every time you face winter, or fight a fever, or look at the stars and imagine stories, you echo them. Their disappearance was not absolute, it was transformation. Here's your first joke of this final section. When people say, we're all human, Neanderthals and Denisovans would probably smirk and add, and a little bit us too. And beyond biology, their story is a mirror. They remind you that dominance is not destiny, that survival can turn on chance. They remind you that your species' triumph was never inevitable. If a few winters had been harsher, if sapiens' networks had been smaller, perhaps the world would now belong to Neanderthals or Denisovans, and Homo sapiens would be the vanished cousins. History is not a straight road, but a forest of paths, most of which ended in silence. Second joke of the section. If Neanderthals could post a final status update, it might read, logged off 40,000 years ago, still buffering in your DNA. And so you reach the quiet end of their tale. You can almost see their last fires fading in Iberian caves, their last hunters watching from Asian mountains, their last children laughing before winter carried them away. The world closed in, and their line dissolved, but their shadows walk with you still. When you look in the mirror, you look into their survival. When you breathe with their gifts. When you dream with echoes of their voices. Now let the pace soften. Let the words stretch like fading firelight. Picture yourself lying in the hush of an ice age night, snow muffling the world outside, only the crackle of embers and the slow rhythm of breath. Around you, Neanderthals once lay the same way. Denisovans once curled against the cold, their children once sighed in sleep. Across time, you share this quiet moment with them, their hands once pressed into cave walls, your hands now type on glowing screens. Different, yet not so different. The thread continues. Third joke of the section. If you wake up tomorrow with bedhead, just tell people it's your Neanderthal genes showing. Ice Age cheek. And now, let the story itself fall into stillness. Neanderthals are gone, Denisovans are gone, but you remain, carrying them with every heartbeat. Their disappearance is a lesson in fragility, but also in connection. You are not alone on the branch of humanity. You are the sum of many branches, living and lost, and when you close your eyes, they are still with you, not as ghosts, but as part of who you are. So breathe deep. Let your body sink into warmth. Let the Ice Age winds fade. Let the fires dim. Let the voices of your lost cousins drift into dreams. The story of Neanderthals and Denisovans has ended, but the story of humanity carries on with you. Sleep now, knowing you are never only yourself. You are a chorus of the living and the lost, still singing in your blood, still whispering in your breath. Good night. Sweet dreams.